Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you who may be on a slightly different time zone and not in California. As Chris French mentioned, my name is Christina Morris, and I am the Senior Field Director of the Los Angeles office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the first in this webinar series on endangered sites of diversity in California. And I'd also like to thank Chris and John and everyone at CPF for partnering with us on this. This was inspired by, and this will come up here in just a moment, the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered Places program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that. It is active right now. 2 of the sites in this webinar, our webinar series, are going to highlight 2 of the sites that were listed on our 11 Most Endangered Places list last year in September. And the one that you're going to hear about today, the Lyon-Martin House, we anticipate, because of its significance and because of its threat, it will also be nominated for consideration on our 2021 list for 11 Most Endangered Places. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this program, oh, sorry, Chris, go back to that earlier slide. Thank you so much. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this program, it is one of the National Trust's most effective public relations and advocacy programs that we have. We've been doing this for over 30 years. It is an incredibly effective advocacy tool that really helps to promote and encourage high-profile preservation wins. And so, as the name suggests, we pick 11 sites every year from dozens or sometimes hundreds of applications across the country. But it's more than just a media moment to try to attract attention to a threatened site. For us, this is an incredibly important tool to help us collaborate with partners, both inside and outside the National Trust, partners across the country. Sometimes they are preservation organizations and sometimes they're not, to really help them support the work that they're trying to do at the local level. Not just to bring attention to a site, but also to help work towards a solution for that site to try to achieve a positive outcome. And in the last several years, we've really been turning our work to make sure that we are focusing on sites that help tell the full American story. And so you will see, next slide, Chris. In particular, our 2020 list had an incredible emphasis on diversity of place and theme, not just in the places that we selected, the history associated with those places, but also the people who are working to save these places and ensure that they have a productive and positive future. And so you'll see 2 of the sites here that you will hear if you join us for the upcoming webinars on the 26th of this month and on the 2nd of February, which is the Harada House in Riverside, California, and the West Berkeley Shell Mound in Berkeley, California. Next slide, please. And for those of you out there listening who might have a place in your community that is significant to you and that is threatened, it doesn't have to be with demolition. It doesn't have to be that the bulldozers are rumbling and ready to take it down. It can be a longer term threat. It can be a lack of a plan for how this place is going to be preserved and reused. I highly encourage you to submit an application. The nominations are open now through February 1st, and you can see right here the link to that. I will put the link to that in the chat box so everybody has that, but it's savingplaces.org/11mostnominations. It's an online process, very easy to do. And if you are interested but aren't quite sure if you should apply, feel free to send an email to 11most@savingplaces.org. And I or someone else on our 11 Most vetting team would be happy to talk to you. Our national media announcement this year about the 11 Most will be on June 3rd. And with that, thank you all for that. I hope that has prompted some thoughts about an 11 Most site here in California and elsewhere. I have the task, the lovely, delightful task of introducing our speakers today and also giving everybody a sense of the agenda. I am so honored to be able to work with Shane and Terry and Supervisor Randleman's staff today, as well as the planning staff today, to bring you all the history of the Lyon-Martin House in the Noe Valley of San Francisco. So today you're going to hear from Shane Watson. And she will be providing you an overview about the Lyon-Martin House, the relationship of the two women that the house was named for, and the significant movements, LGBTQ movements that they're responsible for. After that, you'll be hearing from Supervisor Raphael Mandelman in San Francisco, who is going to provide an overview of the landmarking process that he and his staff and his office have initiated, why they think it is so important to San Francisco and San Francisco's history to make sure that this property is landmarked and preserved. After that, Shane will talk to us about the Friends of the Lyon-Martin House and how you can join in this effort and help ensure that the Lyon-Martin House legacy is preserved for another generation. And then you'll be hearing from Terry Beswick, who about the history of the LGBTQ preservation movement through the GLBT Historical Society and the work that he and his team do there. And that will then we'll wrap up with what we hope will be a healthy and interesting Q&A conversation that will be led by Chris and John, the CPF staff. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. First up is Shane Watson. Hello, Shane, how are you?
Hi, everyone.
So Shane Watson is an award-winning architectural historian and preservationist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's the co-author of the citywide historic context statement for LGBTQ history in San Francisco and the San Francisco chapter of the National Park Service's nationwide LGBTQ theme study, LGBTQ America. So she is an authority on this history and this topic. She is also a committee co-chair for the San Francisco citywide LGBTQ cultural heritage strategy and a founding chair of the GLBT Historical Society's Historic Places Working Group. Welcome, Shane. Thank you for doing this with us today. Can't wait to hear more about the Lyon-Martin House. We're also going to hear today from Supervisor Raphael Mandelman. I don't know if he is able to join us yet, but I'll go ahead and do his intro right now. He has represented District 8 on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors since 2018. He is the lone LGBTQ member of the board, and he represents the Castro and Noe Valley neighborhoods where the Lyon-Martin House is located. In October of last year, and many thanks to him for spearheading this effort, he introduced the resolution initiating the local landmarking process for the Lyon-Martin House. And then we'll also be hearing today from Terry. Terry, can you join us for just a second? Terry Beswick. Hi, Terry. How are you?
Hey, Chris.
So Terry has served as the executive director of the GLBT Historical Society for 5 years. While overseeing the organization's growing archival and exhibition programs, he founded the Castro LGBTQ Cultural District and has co-chaired the San Francisco LGBTQ Cultural Heritage Strategy. Previously, he worked for many years as an AIDS activist and spearheaded a campaign to preserve San Francisco's Castro Country Club for the queer recovery community. And we're going to be hearing some about the database that they've compiled and some of the work they do. So thank you, Terry, for joining us today to share that information.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Shane to kick us off. Shane, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Okay, great. So I want to start off by saying just a couple thank yous. Thank you so much to the California Preservation Foundation, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the GLBT Historical Society for their support in drawing attention to this house. And a huge thanks to District 8 Supervisor Raphael Mandelman for initiating the landmark process, the San Francisco Planning Department for writing what I know will be an outstanding landmark nomination, and the Friends of the Lyon-Martin House, which you can join. I'll tell you about that at the end of my talk. Especially to Greta Miller, who's on the East Coast somewhere. We've never actually met, but she set up the Friends of Lyon-Martin House website, and I'm so grateful for her helping me with the community side of this process. And finally, thanks to all of you who are here to hear about this site of tremendous importance to the LGBTQ communities. I hope you're all safe and healthy. So, a little bit about Phyllis Lyon on the left here and Dell-Martin. The two of them met in 1950 while they were living in Seattle. Dell was a San Francisco native, and she studied journalism at San Francisco State University. Phyllis Lyon was born in, I think, Tulsa, Oklahoma, but her family moved to the Bay Area when she was fairly young. She attended UC Berkeley and studied journalism as well. When Dell and Phyllis met, Phyllis was working at the Pacific Builder and Engineer, a weekly publication that covered building and engineering projects in the Western US. I thought the architectural history nerds would get a kick out of that. Phyllis Lyon left Seattle in 1953 and moved to San Francisco, renting an apartment on the first floor of this building you can see on the right. It's on Castro Street, and this is about 1 block south of Harvey Milk's future residence and camera shop. A few months later, on Valentine's Day, 1953, Martin moved in and the couple lived together on Castro Street for 2 years. So in 1955, Lyon and Martin purchased this house you can see here at 651 Duncan Street. It is a 756 square foot, 1-bedroom, 1-bath cottage on a hillside with an incredible view of San Francisco. On the left, adjacent to the house, you can see that there's an undeveloped lot that is part of this property. It's actually 2 legal parcels. The house was built, here's another view, a close-up. So the house was built sometime between 1914 and 1938. It wasn't there on the Sanborn map you can see on the left, but it is there in this aerial photograph from 1938 on the right. The interior of the house has hardly changed since the 1970s. These are the recent real estate photographs. The house was sold in September 2020. And as you can see here with a photograph of Phyllis Lyon on the right, the living room is virtually unchanged. And here's another one of Dell sitting by the window. So just a quick summary of Lyon-Martin and Phyllis Lyon's list of achievements. The whole list is absolutely breathtaking and far too long to summarize here. But the highlights are these. These women co-founded the Daughters of Bilitis in 1955, which was the nation's first social and political organization for lesbians. They were co-founders of the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, which was the first homophile organization in the country with a religious church affiliation and support. They were the first couple married in February 2004, the first same-sex wedding after Mayor Gavin Newsom ordered the city clerk to provide same-sex marriage licenses. And again, in June 2008, they were the first couple to marry in California after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. And I am now going to pass it over to District 8 Supervisor Mandelman. Is he on the call?
I don't see him yet in the room unless Jacob's account is with it.
Hey Shane, this is Jacob Bentliff in the supervisor's office. He's going to be joining us very shortly, and so I just wanted to thank you for that overview and thought maybe, I don't know if you want to touch on the Friends group before we go into his piece. We might do that.
So I'm going to share my screen again. So as I mentioned earlier, the house sold in September 2020, and I got wind of this I was scrolling mindlessly through Facebook and came across this advertisement from SF Gate, or this article mentioning that this tiny house in Noe Valley sold for $2.25 million. And I knew right away that it was the Lyon-Martin house. So I started organizing, and a big group of preservationists, community members, friends of Dell and Phyllis, historians, planners, just lots of different people came together. We had a meeting on Zoom in September think it was September 24th, 2020, to talk about what do we do? How can we stop this? I mean, the part of the concern was, as you can see here, it's off announcement from, it was touted as the property itself was touted as a redevelopment opportunity, unprecedented blank canvas to create a custom estate or two on a beautiful street whose homes have fetched over $6 million. So the exciting thing that happened right before we organized this meeting is Jacob Bentliff from Supervisor Mandelman's office contacted me and said the supervisor's in this process, and we will soon hear about that from Supervisor Mandelman. But he initiated the landmark process in October 2020 at a land use committee hearing, and the Board of Supervisors unanimously voted to support initiating the landmark. And then it was sent to the planning department for Pilar LaValle, a senior planner at the department, to write the actual landmark nomination. And all of these people will be here at the end for Q&A, so we can talk about that. Let's see, the house has no preservation protections currently. It has never been nominated as a state, local, or a local, state, or national landmark until now. So essentially it is extremely threatened, and we have some insight about the new property owners, and they do want to build on the property. So I see that Supervisor Mandelman is here, so I will hand it, just quickly. Please join us. There's a website, friendsofthelionmartinhouse.com. You can see at the bottom. And we will be continuing to be involved with this process throughout the rest of it. So welcome, Supervisor Mandelman. Thank you for being here. Would you like to say a few words?
Hey, sorry, I was suffering from technical difficulties in getting myself in here, but I got in. Thank you, Shane. I caught a little bit of your presentation, and thank you for all of your work on queer cultural historical assets in San Francisco, and on this one in particular. And of course, I want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the California Preservation Foundation for including the Lyon-Martin House in this series. I know people are probably, at this point in the presentation, pretty familiar with the house and its significance. My experience of the house, I got to visit Phyllis back when the first time I ran for supervisor, probably it must have been about 2009 or 2010. And I remember, of course, being a little starstruck because I knew who she was, and I knew she was important, and being able to go up and sit with her for a little while in that home was very cool for me. She was a widow at that point, I believe, but still was had insights and thoughts. And she had thoughts about development in her neighborhood, and was actually kind of annoyed by one of the rather large homes that had crept into her neighborhood and actually significantly blocked her view. And so, of course, when she died earlier last year, I think it made a lot of sense for folks to begin thinking about what would happen to this home, which happens to be in a part of San Francisco that has been sort of continually gentrifying over the last 20 or 30 years, that has seen the loss of a sort of the older housing stock and homes quite like this disappearing and being replaced by the rather large homes like the rather large one next door that so annoyed Phyllis. I was gratified to see the community and the Historical Society and Shane and neighbors beginning to think about how to make sure that this site could be commemorated and didn't just get lost as a development opportunity. So I think you've heard a little bit about the process. You know, from my perspective, this effort, I guess, began back in August or September. I think September was when we were contacted by Shane and the Historical Society about a neighborhood meeting. And we showed up there, and there seemed to be strong support for my moving forward with the resolution to initiate the landmarking process under our local rules. And so we introduced that legislation. It passed unanimously in October. And so the review by the Planning Department Historic Preservation Commission has been undertaken. A hearing at the Historic Preservation Commission is now scheduled for February 17th. They'll make a recommendation. It'll come back to the Board of Supervisors. They're going to look at, and I'm sure you've already talked about this, but sort of what are the historic elements of this property? What is important to preserve? That recommendation will come back to the Board of Supervisors, where we would need to officially add the property to the list of local landmarks by ordinance. And then the result of that listing, which probably also has been shared with folks today, is that any proposed alteration or development of the property would need to be reviewed and approved by the Historic Preservation Commission. There's lots still to determine clearly about what is the historic, you know, how to define the historic value of the site and what would need to be preserved for the future. But I'm glad that we've undertaken this process and that there is going to be some thoughtful analysis of this amazing and important historic queer site. So you know, I'm happy that I've been able to be part of this, and am grateful to the great organizing and work by SF Heritage and the LGBT Historical Society, GLBT Historical Society, and the Friends of Lyon-Martin House, and of course Shane. You know, I think this conversation is important for this site. It's important for other sites. There are, I think, I'm looking at my notes, 5 designated landmarks, queer landmarks in San Francisco, but of course there's so much more history than that. And so I want to express gratitude to the folks, including Shane, who've worked on the 2015 LGBTQ historic context statement, which, you know, I think has identified dozens of other potential sites. I want to thank Aaron Highland, if he is here, who's the Historic Preservation Commissioner, who's expressed great interest in this. We're looking forward to working with Aaron and others on looking at some other sites that may also be endangered, but whether endangered or not, are worthy of designation. So it's great to be here with all of you, and apologies for my tardiness and my technical difficulties. And with that, I will hand it off to the next person.
Thank you, Supervisor Mandelman. You were right on time, by the way. I think I was.
Oh, thank God.
Talk as long. So now I would like to bring in Terry Beswick at the GLBT Historical Society to talk about the Historical Society's long-standing programs and efforts to preserve sites associated with LGBTQ history. Terry?
Thank you, Shane. And thank you to the California Preservation Foundation and the National Trust for putting this forum together. And but Shane, in particular, I just want to thank you for your leadership in bringing attention to this wonderful resource that we have here in San Francisco and that we're in danger of losing. And Supervisor Mandelman, I just want to say big shout out and thanks to you and your staff for your leadership in bringing this landmarking process together. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Historical Society to let everybody know who we are, so that people might think about their organizing efforts locally and how they might work with local organizations. So, you know, our role in this process is basically threefold. First of all, we have historic content in our archives. We have one of the largest collections of LGBTQ historic materials in the world in our downtown San Francisco location. And the second would be advocacy. So we organize and try to draw attention to preservation efforts that are requiring attention and organizing within San Francisco. And I've worked with Shane in particular on that. Shane was, as was mentioned, the founding chair of our Historic Places Working Group in San Francisco. And we've actually done a lot of projects over the last several years that I wanted to mention. But before I do that, I just want to call attention to our San Francisco LGBTQ sites database, which is a really incredible effort that was put together in the early 1980s by Eric Garber and Willie Walker, founders of our organization. And it includes 2,000 LGBTQ historic sites, nearly 2,000 sites in this database, which is searchable by site type, site name, location, dates, description, and citations. And so it's a really wonderful resource, and we're actually looking for funding right now to clean it up and make it more widely available. Currently, it's only available by visiting our archives. But it is the basis for a lot of our advocacy work, and also of the historic context statement, which Shane co-authored with Donna Graves in 2015, and it's listed on our website if anybody wants to take a look at that. And also fiscal sponsorship. And so we were the fiscal sponsor of the historic context statement and have been for a number of other projects, including this Friends of the Lyon-Martin House effort. I did want to share a screen right now just to go back to the archives materials that we have available. And this is just one of our primary source sets. We've been working very hard to move a lot of our exhibits and archival materials online over the last year. And this is one that we put together, which is drawing on just a sampling of our Phyllis Lyon and Dell Martin papers, which is really a huge collection. It's actually one of the largest collections we have at 203 boxes, 83.4 linear feet. But if you have the time, please go to this website and check out this primary source set. Watch some of the video, listen to the recordings. I really found some of the recordings really amazing. And I think we have one up that was just recently digitized from Zane Blaney from the 1980s on here. And if it's not, then it's somewhere else. But you can kind of poke around our website and take a look at that. And finally, I just want to mention that Shane and I have worked together on the LGBTQ Cultural Heritage Strategy, which is a wonderful report that we submitted to the Board of Supervisors and Marriages last year that looks at many issues in terms of cultural preservation as we face gentrification and displacement in San Francisco. Came out just prior to the pandemic, and of course now there's a whole new set of issues that come up. But check it out on our website along with the historic context statement. And with that, I just want to wrap it up and just be available for questions.
Thank you, Terry. So I just want to say quickly again, if you want to join us in these efforts, go to friendsoflyonmartinhouse.com. I think there's some dashes in there, but it's easy to find if you Google it. And we also just got notification that the first hearing at the Historic Preservation Commission has been set for, let's see, February 17th. Pilar, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and let us know what time that is? Our first call to action as a community supporting this landmarking effort is definitely to show up at these hearings and either write a letter of support or speak in support. So please help us with that. We do expect to get a little bit of pushback on the landmark nomination. So hi.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, sure. So I'm Pilar Lavallee. I'm a senior preservation planner at the San Francisco Planning Department. And as was mentioned earlier, now that the board has initiated the nomination, it's been passed to the Planning Department and ultimately the Historic Preservation Commission for review and recommendation. And that hearing, as Shane just mentioned, is currently scheduled for February 17th, 2021. And the Historic Preservation Commission hearings start at 12:30 p.m. and they're the first and third Wednesdays of every month. They are virtual as of this current moment, and expected to stay that way for a while yet. And yeah, there'll be the notice and information about participating in the hearing, making public comment will go up on our website about the planning department website about a week beforehand. Yes, as I said, I'm working on writing up the nomination documentation. So I'll go ahead and put a plug right here for if anyone has information about the history of the house, about the personal histories and lives of Lyon-Martin and Phyllis Lyon, and would like to share that, or visited the house, visited them at the house, please, I can put my contact information in the chat, and if you'd like to share anything, that'd be great. Also, you can send any comments in terms of support of the designation to me and to the Historic Preservation Commission as well.
Thanks so much, Pilar.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to quickly mention we're having a lot of questions come into the Q&A box. So just a reminder that people to ask your questions, just use that Q&A box. And we have a new feature that we've enabled, which allows our attendees to upvote questions. So that should bring the questions that are most relevant to the top. So if you're interested in having a question responded to, just click the thumbs up symbol on that, and that'll allow us to sort of filter through those. Chris, did you want to take the first question?
Yeah, everyone who's involved, the panelists, you can go ahead and start your videos again. One of the questions I wanted to start with actually came through the chat, which is, what is the preferred nomenclature for that the owners would prefer, lesbian or queer, so that we can know how to talk about this project? Lesbian, okay. Thank you, Shane. That answers that. And so now we know that came in through the chat. And John, did you want to start with the Q&As?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. So the first question that I think I'd like to ask our panelists, and anybody who would like to respond, please speak up first. We're not going to take these in order or anything. The question was, is there any reason why this property wasn't designated years ago?
I can speak to that, John.
Okay.
So in 2011, I contacted Phyllis Lyon and met with her in the living room of the house and asked her if I could nominate the property for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. After quite a bit of back and forth with her advisors at the time and her accountant, she decided to decline that. So we knew going forward that she was not interested in any sort of designation for the house. I think it had to do with, you know, the possibility, often the myths surrounding landmarking and preservation, that the house will lose, you know, it won't be worth as much as it was, you know, those sorts of things. But yeah, and then in the San Francisco Historic Context Statement that Donna Graves and I wrote, we have, I think, about 25 landmarks that we call out of the 300 or something sites that we talk about. And the Lyon-Martin house is one of those recommended for landmark status. So.
Great, thanks, Shane. I wanted to ask maybe any of you, but maybe Chris Morris knows in particular, just to start our conversation, to add more of that nationwide context. Do you happen to know how many queer LGBTQ plus sites are designated nationally or are recognized nationally?
Oh, I would think that would be a much better question for someone like Shane, or I know I saw Donna Graves is on the call, so perhaps if Shane doesn't know, Donna might be able to chime in, but I don't have that information.
Oh, Donna, if you're in the chat, you can also post that in the chat. Shane, do you have any idea?
I think so. Let's see, in 2009, it was just the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And then slowly a couple more started trickling in. And now I don't think it's more than a dozen, but I could be wrong if someone else wants to try. I'm talking about National Register or National Historic Landmark.
Yeah.
I believe, Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask you if you could just give in a one sentence about Stonewall Inn, because maybe not everyone knows the significance of that property.
Sure. Stonewall Inn was a bar in New York City that was the site of what we now look to as a watershed moment in LGBTQ history. The police had been, the bar itself was owned by the mob. There was a lot of payoff between the mob and bar owners back then. This was the 1960s. And one night, the patrons, the police came into the bar, the patrons decided instead of taking it to fight back. And that experience is now what we know as the Stonewall Uprising. I believe it was 1969.
So we have a question that I'm going to give this a try. Looks like somebody raised their hand, and it's somebody I'm familiar with. So nobody will be Zoom bombing us today. His name is Bill Ellinger, and he's from Pasadena. So I'm going to ask him to unmute here. And if he's not able to unmute, I have a question ready for everybody. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
just quickly. So Matthew Bajako in the chat says there are 14 LGBTQ historic places. I'm thinking he means National Register listing. So.
Oh, great, thank you. That's helpful. Now there was a question in the Q&A box that I wanted to ask. The question was, if the house is landmarked, what will it protect? The land, the building, the interior? And are there any plans to take ownership of the property and turn it into a living history site or interpretive site of some type?
Well, I think Shane and Pilar would probably be best to answer this question, but the ultimate goals of the Friends group has not been totally decided yet. At this point, I think the ultimate goal for the site is still in the exploration phase, but Pilar, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the limitations are of the landmarking process, or what it provides in terms of options.
Hi, sure. I think so, as Supervisor Mandelman mentioned earlier, part of the Historic Preservation Commission's recommendation and review process, as well as the ultimate landmark designation itself, which will be approved by the Board of Supervisors, does include a list of we will work to identify character defining features or significant historic features of the property. And those will be a particular focus for any future review, a review of any future projects, and obviously protection of those. But ultimately, once a property is designated locally, any development projects would require review and approval by the Historic Preservation Commission. So they would focus on those particular features, but ultimately they would look at the project as a project or projects as a whole.
Thanks, Pilar. I had a question for everybody involved who's been working on it. Sounds like, and Shane, I'm going to give you an award for getting this thing up and running so fast just by seeing that that advertisement and that for sale. I know everyone's been involved too, but that's amazing that you noticed that. So I wanted to ask if you find, I know as a preservationist, I find myself frustrated when sites of significance are dismissed as the tear down next to the adjacent lot because you can get a great city view from this property. I mean, how did you feel, any of you could answer this, how do you feel when you see something that's so important just be sort of pushed aside like that?
Well, for me, my first thought was, this is, you know, we have to do something, nothing can happen to this house. And I still feel very strongly that we will have enough support that nothing will happen to this house. But you know, the downside of this is that it is private property. It is now owned by a couple who want to build their family a home on this site, either on the adjacent parcel or the whole thing. We don't really, there hasn't been a project hasn't been proposed yet. So we do hope to bring together all of these different stakeholders at some point and brainstorm, what exactly do we want to see happen to this house? Is it just a landmark? Is it just a plaque on the sidewalk? Or is it, like an artist in residency program, or a writer or researcher in residency program? Of course, that would mean we would have to fundraise and buy the house. But we'll, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I think that's all good. And I would just add, Christine, that this is just one site, and as Supervisor Mendelman mentioned, there's maybe 4 or 5 others that have achieved some landmarking status in San Francisco. But San Francisco has really been the cradle of the modern LGBTQ rights movement. I mean, Stonewall was mentioned, but there were many other historic events that took place in San Francisco before and after Stonewall, and this organizing effort around the Daughters of Bilitis, going back to the 1950s, has such fundamental significance for our place within history, within the development of an understanding of equality around sexual and gender differences. And so for us, when we take a look at that, what we're looking at through the lens of decades of being less than, of being an oppressed minority that are denied our basic fundamental rights to love who we choose, to live where we choose, to be free from fear of being fired or evicted because of who we are. And it's only very recently that that has shifted, at least on the legal landscape, but the discrimination is still there. And people are still growing up feeling those differences and that kind of oppression. And so when we look at a site like this and our shared ancestry, our shared sense of commonality as an LGBTQ rights community, we really attach a great deal of emotional significance to it, and also historical significance. And when we lose that sense of place and connection to our history, we can never get it back. It's just gone. And that feels very painful to many of us on a deep emotional level. And so that's why for us, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Let's do this wherever it may take us. Let's do the best that we can.
I had a little bit of follow-up. In the chat window, Peter was commenting, and I had a similar question, which is a lot of these owners kind of, the new owners are caught unawares. They buy their dreamland and they're not, and then they find out suddenly that it's historic. I think that's one of the issues that preservationists have been working towards for a long time, which is to be more proactive about identifying the site so that the person who buys it is find themselves in this, the middle of a situation. You had mentioned that there's an LGBTQ context statement, and there might be a URL that we could share with everybody. Does anyone have that at hand? And I can post that in the chat box.
Yeah, actually, Donna posted the link. We have it on our website, but planning has it on their website also. And so if you scroll up in the chat, I think Donna Graves posted it there.
Oh, good. Or we can repost it again.
Yeah, I'll actually post another link to it to our website.
Yeah, it gets lost in the chat box. It gets way up there. But I think that would be useful because I think that's one of the problems with a lot of the sites that we deal with, that they're not openly identified. Someone buys the property and then boom, it turns into a thing. Anyway, so I just wanted to address that. I think John has the next question, right, John?
Yes, I do actually. There's a question that came in through Facebook, and I've been monitoring these. Nancy is asking if she's curious if there was any kind of estate planning that could have happened to save this property, and if they ever thought of that, if you have any insight into that.
I mean, there could have been things inserted into a trust document or something, but I don't know that any of that happened. I think, and rightly so, the number one focus of Phyllis and her caregivers at the end of her life was to make sure she was as comfortable as possible and still living in the house. So, I support that and understand for sure.
I just have a follow-up question on that, Shane. Were there any artifacts left in the house? Was the house empty when it was sold, or what happened to everything? I'm sorry if you already mentioned that. I'm just wondering what might have happened to her items. Did those go to Terry?
So Terry might know. Yeah, I don't know. The house is now empty. Terry, do
Yes,
you know?
we do. Yes. Shortly after Phyllis passed, which was what now, 2 years ago almost, their daughter, who we'd worked with in the past, did reach out to us, and we made sure to. We already had, their papers, as I mentioned earlier, but we did make sure to secure whatever was important from a preservationist or archival standpoint, and so those were added to our existing collections in the archive. But I think there has also been some photo documentation that was done, and maybe Shane can talk a little bit about that. I think, which I think would be important for Pilar's report.
Yeah, I just know of a woman named Deborah Sadobova. Sorry, Deborah. She is documenting, or has documented the house extensively with high resolution digital photography and video. She's making a mini documentary, or maybe not even mini, a documentary about the end of Phyllis's life in the house.
And there were I'll move to another question that sort of relates to a number of people who are asking questions, and I'm going to try to roll them all into one question. First of all, a lot of people are curious about the designation process, and I know this is basic for a lot of us as somewhat career preservationists, but maybe there's a lot of people in the room who don't really understand how the process works, and maybe you can kind of quickly summarize the thought process and strategy behind designating the Lyon-Martin house and why you made the decisions you did. There could have been an option to go locally, statewide, national. You could even go as high as National Historic Landmark, I think. So why did you go initially with straight to the National Register sort of option?
So the house is being nominated as a San Francisco landmark, so it's a local.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And in California, under California Environmental Quality Act, local landmarking provides the most teeth in terms of precedent. Pilar, is there anything you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I would have said something similar. I think, local landmarking, there's no requirement to start at one level or another, as far as I know. But yeah, generally local landmark status has slightly more teeth, as Shane just mentioned, given that the projects do require after a designation happens, any future projects would require a certificate of appropriateness and review and approval by the Historic Preservation Commission. Also, it's in San Francisco for our designations. Owner approval or support is not required.
Yeah, and I would
That's
just
go ahead,
chime in
Jacob.
as well, and that's all. Yeah, totally. What my understanding as well from working with Pilar and others at planning. I think just to say that part of the reason that we moved forward with the resolution from the Board of Supervisors was when the things were happening fairly quickly. Phyllis passed last spring, and then the house came up and was sold very quickly. And then when Shane and Terry and others reached out with the community group, it was clear that there was just a lot of concern of what would be happening. And so we have different ways to initiate the process here locally. It can be from the community via an application, or the Preservation Commission can do it, but kind of the fastest option was for the Board of Supervisors to do that. So it was just, in our view, really a way of making sure that there was some process underway to provide a level of historic review for whenever an application to do any work on the property would come forward. And we really see it as just making sure there's a seat at the table, for the community and for preservation professionals in that conversation that may not have been there if we were on a longer track. for another type of designation. So that was kind of some of the thinking on our end.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Chris, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you, Jacob. That's incredibly helpful. I just wanted to jump in with a quick comment and observation. A lot of people have been asking about sort of the designation process and how many places are listed. It's fantastic that these context statements exist to provide us with this larger context and to identify sites like this, and that there are these local landmarking efforts that are happening across the country. But the reality is that less than 10%, perhaps 8% of the places listed on the National Register of Historic Places are associated with sites of diversity of any kind. And while there are organizations across the country, like the LGBT Historical Society here, organizations in New York that are working to help address that, we all have a role to play in helping to make that happen. And so I hope that one of the things that we'll think about is getting the Lyon-Martin House and some of these other places that Donna and Shane and Terry have identified locally designated and on the National Register. And I just want to put in a plug for the National Trust's preservation funds. You can apply to us to help you with those research and designation projects, whether it's for local landmarking, to do your own context studies, or to put things on the National Register, particularly to get things locally listed. We want to try to see that number go up so that we are doing more to recognize these sites and tell a more full American story. And I put that information in the chat, but I'll put that link in again for everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Don't you just love the chat? We can just keep going with a lot of these links, and then people can sort of be cross-referencing. I wanted to follow up on that, Chris, because a lot of the numbers that we refer to are actually we don't have any numbers, so we don't really know for sure how many sites on the National Register. We can guess, right? We've been doing this for a couple of decades now, but we don't really know for sure. And the other question the question is, when do we stop grouping these things together, marginalizing them just by the fact that we're calling them different? So let's say there, somebody had asked, there's, we have to differentiate the lesbian sites from the gay sites, from the transgender sites, from the Mexican sites, from the, even this program that we're doing with these three, we're distinguishing them by pulling them out and highlighting them. But when do we get to the point where this is just something that's part of what we do as preservationists, and we don't have to keep singling it to make sure it gets the special attention? Do you see any progress with this, Chris, with what we've been doing nationwide?
Oh, I think so. I mean, it's a very valid point that, in some ways, just sort of lumping everything together as diverse is in many ways kind of minimizing the individuality and significance of each group and sort of their own contributions. But I've seen so much. I mean, just even the nature of the conversations that have taken place. I feel like at our last conference, the National Preservation Conference in October, there was so much more conversation around, and I'm not going to pretend like this is perfect, but there's so much more conversation around these questions of integrity, of diversity, how to work with both other preservation partners and other types of groups that aren't preservation organizations in order to increase both the relevancy, but also the kind of the immediacy of the work. So I personally, in the 16 years I've been in this work, doing this work, have seen a significant shift. We've got a long way to go though, but it seems like there is certainly much more recognition about the need to be much more mindful and intentional about understanding the layers of significance and also not letting integrity get in the way. I think we tend to, in some ways, kind of fetishize the physical. And so really looking at these places for what happened there, who was involved, what are the stories that can be told, and how can this be meaningful to another generation, as opposed to just worrying about the physicality and what pieces are still there. But others, I'm sure others have a different perspective.
Yeah, I just want to briefly mention in response to one of the comments that, the LGBTQ community as a whole, although we're part of larger society and we're probably one of the most diverse communities as such that there exists in modern society, we do have segments within us and we have subcultures, and as a whole, we're a fairly recent recognized group that has been historically marginalized. And so we have to go and we have to look at, frequently lesbians within our community have been their history and their culture has been overlooked and sometimes underfunded in terms of preservation. Same with transgender sites and communities. And so we do have to make an extra effort to make sure that those voices are brought forward.
I have a question. There was mention of Stonewall, but Ellen in the Q&A was asking, she was saying perhaps our panelists can briefly talk about how lesbian culture seems to be being lost at a rapid rate, and resources for its preservation and enrichment are often seen as more difficult to acquire. And with your knowledge of all the sites associated with lesbian history in the Bay Area or beyond, can you sort of give us tell us the story of what sort of sites beyond the Lyon-Martin house might need to be protected?
So in San Francisco, there are, I think it's a very small number of local San Francisco landmarks associated with LGBTQ history. The Harvey Milk residence and camera shop. Recently, the home of the paper doll, which was one of San Francisco's earliest sort of like LGBTQ community supported restaurants and bar, and a couple others. But really, for the most part, those landmarks in San Francisco focus on the experiences of white gay men. There are, as far as I know, no landmarks that highlight the history of transgender folks, and specifically, and not any sites specifically focused on the history of the lesbian community in San Francisco. Donna Graves wrote the National Register nomination for the Women's Building, so that was a great addition, but still the number of lesbian associated sites in San Francisco that aren't designated, it's dozens of what I would call significant spaces, but no protection, no designation, no landmarks. So we have a lot of work to do, for sure.
Thanks, Shane. I think we should start wrapping it up, and I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to share with people any other links that you might want to share, Shane or Pilar, Terry, Chris Morris, and Jacob. If you want to post any of the links that you want people to follow in the chat, this would be a great time to do that. Also, is there any, Shane, is there any way people can follow your preservation journey, I'll call it for right now? Do you have an Instagram or anything dedicated to this particular effort?
My Instagram is mostly focused on my dog and my cats, so I don't have anything. But the Friends of Lyon-Martin House, we do have a very robust email list that I send out emails to people talking about what upcoming events. So if you can email me at sewatson77@yahoo.com and let me know if you're interested in being a part of this effort, and I will add you to our list and send you everything I have to enlighten you about the Lyon-Martin House.
Let me type that in, sewatson77 at
yahoo.com. I know,
okay.
it's embarrassing that I still have a Yahoo, but that's
I wasn't going to say anything. Well, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today, and also want to make sure that we, two things. One is what you said about integrity, Chris Morris, was really important, and I also think showing that sites that are culturally significant and not necessarily architecturally significant have just as much importance for preservation, but are often harder to for people to recognize. Doesn't look historic. I get that a lot. Doesn't look historic. So I think this is at this site and the other sites that we'll be talking about in this series with the National Trust. I exemplify that in particular. So the next one we're talking about is the Harada House. And that is going to be, I was trying to look up it should be next Tuesday at noon, and Chris Morris will be joining us again. And then the Tuesday after that will be the Ohlone Shell Mounds in West Berkeley, and which is now a parking lot. So both of these sites have such amazing significance. Chris, did you want to just tell people what they're to look forward to in the next couple? of
Oh,
webinars?
sure. Well, first of all, just let me say thank you again to you and to all of our panelists, Shane and Terry and Pilar and Supervisor Mandelman and Jacob. It's been great to have you all here for this conversation. And yes, the whole purpose of this webinar that we're hosting, with many thanks to CPF, is to really bring more attention to these endangered sites of different kinds of diversity around California. And as you can see, even though we do have a landmark nomination here in progress, which is fantastic news for this site, there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done about how this site ends up preserved, what it ends up used for, and hopefully in a way that really helps to keep the Lyon-Martin, to Phyllis and Dell's legacy alive and help serve the needs of the LGBTQ community, particularly the lesbian community, since that was what their intention was while they were alive. And so I'm really looking forward to working with everyone to think about how we can do that, make sure that this stays alive in that way. But our next two sites are two sites that were listed on our 11 most last year. There has been great progress on both of them. The Harada House is actually a civil rights site. This was a family that was interned during World War II. The house was kept for them by their neighbors. They faced enormous pressure, enormous discrimination. So it's a really fascinating and moving story about immigration, citizenship, democracy, discrimination, and how this family persisted, and then how they turned this into a site of healing and reconciliation post-World War II after the family returned from internment. So it's a really wonderful story, now owned by the city of Riverside, and they're facing some of the same struggles to think about how to fund the reuse of that site. And I hope everyone tunes in for that, as well as the piece with the Ohlone Shell Mound and Karina Gould, who is just an amazing activist and advocate for Ohlone history, cultural history.
Great. And my job here is to tell everybody goodbye, but also thank you to our speakers. Thank you all very much. What I'll do is I'll leave the room open for everybody because there's a wealth of information in the chat box. There are still links being posted there, so feel free to stay in the room and click on those links. For our speakers, you're welcome to leave at any time. I'm going to turn my sound and video off. And then before I leave, I'm going to paste into the chat box a link to our feedback form. We'd love to hear your thoughts, especially we'd like to hear what sort of programs we're missing that we're not doing that you think we should do. We still have some spots in the 2021 calendar year to do some great programs. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Chris, do you have anything else?
I do. I wanted to thank all of our sponsors for helping us put on these free programs for the public. And you can check all of our sponsors at our website. It's californiapreservation.org. And we really encourage you to join or donate, because all of these donations that we're getting have helped us keep these programs free. And then we can welcome people from all over the country to join. And I did notice that we had a national attendance. So that was really fun and surprising. So like John said, go ahead and read the chat for a little bit, and we'll see you again next Tuesday at noon.